all of you may recall, the Legislative Counsel Committee met in January and adopted 2 policies to implement 2017 public records legislation concerning how the legislative branch responds to public records requests. And at that time, there was also conceptual discussion of these 4 policies before you today. And since then, the Public Records Subcommittee has met twice to review these policies, and they last met on Monday and reviewed and recommended to you that they be adopted. So with that background, may I turn to specific policies?
Please do.
All right, then the first one is policy 142-111, and that is in response to the 2017 legislation directed the Office of Legislative Counsel to prepare open government impact statements. When a proposed legislation modifies the standards by which public records are disclosed or creates a new exemption, something like that. And it also said in the 2017 legislation that an open government impact statement should note whether the proposed legislation is in conformance with drafting standards that apply to public records exemptions. And at that time, we didn't actually have drafting standards. This policy 111 sets forth those standards, and I'm not going to go into them in detail. You can see the standards there in items 1 through 4. I would like to highlight, however, that any legislator can, of course, request legislation that does anything, and this policy would only mandate that it be noted on the open government impact statement if a particular measure was drafted out of conformance with these standards.
Discussion of 142-11 as presented. Representative McLean, please.
Dexter, thank you. Your last sentence, could you repeat your last paragraph with regards to, well, let me ask in the form of a question. Did you just say that if for an example, I asked Legislative Counsel to draft something, a bill, and I wanted it done in a certain way, and it was in nonconformance to 142-111, you would note that on the draft of the bill? You would see the noncompliance.
Mr. Chair, Representative McLean, no, it would not be noted on the bill. It would be noted on the open government impact statement that is prepared after the bill is introduced. The policy notes that Legislative Counsel will strive to discuss with a legislator if their request is going to result in nonconformance with those standards. But this is not on the bill, it's only on the open government impact statement, and that is does not appear on OLIS until the bill is introduced.
Follow up.
Representative McLean, please.
Thank you. I think that, so the impact statement would have nothing to do, for an example, with the relating to clause of some LC draft.
Mr. Co-Chair, Representative McLean, that's correct. The open government impact statement is much like a revenue impact statement or fiscal impact statement. It's a separate document and is not legislation. It's not ever going to be a law. It just informs on what the effect of the measure is.
And then follow-up would be, sure. And then who, that's comforting, good. Who gets to decide whether something has a positive impact or a negative impact on public disclosure? or open government?
Mr. Chair, Representative McLean, that would be the public records attorney that Legislative Counsel hired to prepare these statements and also to assist in public records requests.
Okay, may I follow up then? And that public records attorney is hired by whom?
That is a member of Legislative Counsel. It's Cameron Miles is sitting right here.
Okay, so that person can be fired by you?
That's correct.
Okay. How does a legislator appeal a ruling by Legislative Counsel that what they're doing is increasing openness in government or decreasing openness in government?
The legislation, Mr. Chair and Representative McLean, the legislation does not contemplate an appeal of that process. It simply directs that Legislative Counsel prepare open government impact statements. We certainly would consider any, if any legislator would be free, of course, to say that he or she thinks we're wrong, and we would certainly consider that.
All right, well, Mr. Chair, you know, I'm glad to see we have this process. I'm troubled. I don't think we're there yet with this because I have seen legislation be given a revenue impact statement or a fiscal impact statement with the ability of presiding officers to influence that. And as a result, legislation has been thwarted in the politicized open government arena. I worry that that partisan influence would continue. And certainly open government is a hot button in the gubernatorial race. And I'm a little concerned that suddenly you could have a member of a minority party introducing legislation that would be perhaps leveling the playing field, and the majority party could exercise influence over Legislative Counsel's decision and get that deemed to be limiting open government rather than enhancing it. And now everyone, I'm not, I mean, no offense, sir, no offense. But it has been my experience since 2011 that fiscal impact and revenue impact statements haven't been necessarily above board in every single instance. And suddenly we have something as political as this and presiding officers exercising influence on Legislative Counsel. And I get concerned that when a minority party member seeks to increase open government, but it may have an impact on the majority party, that this process may not be as receptive to minority party members. So I'm raising that concern. I'm not saying today I have a great answer, but it's a concern from a perspective of a member of the minority. And I bet you it's not shared by a member of the majority. And who would think of that, huh?
Representative Vile, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. The concerns expressed by Leader McLean are some that I do share. I may have articulated them a little bit differently, but I think they're legitimate. I have a suggestion that if we were to change the language of the policy slightly so that we are not saying that the non-conformance will be noted, that instead we were to phrase it in that there is a disagreement about whether or not this satisfies the 2017 policy. There's no implication then that a member who has required or pushed Legislative Counsel to put language in that legislative counsel doesn't feel like complies, that you're not using that kind of a negative phrase of nonconformance. I think if it just simply in the open government impact statement reflected a genuine disagreement, it would be less likely to have the political impact that I think Leader McLean legitimately raises.
Yes. Yes.
Mr. Co-Chair, and I'd like to just point out one thing that to add to this discussion, that the question of whether a legislative council should prepare open government impact statements that indicate legislative council's opinion on whether a particular measure changes the disclosure of public records or creates an exemption or something like that. That's a matter of statutory law. This policy is simply noting the other thing that the legislature asked legislative council to do, and that was note if the proposed legislation conformed with drafting standards. So the big question about whether this is going to create a new exemption or expand an exemption or contract an exemption, that is a function of statute, not of this policy.
Follow up?
Yes.
Okay. And I recognize that the statute is designed to help us get to a place where we have promoted the maximum amount of disclosure and openness possible, but there remains the fact that we can have legitimate disagreements about whether something does or does not do that. And if we have that disagreement, rather than allowing the system to essentially impugn a member for suggesting a particular policy that legislative council feels like doesn't do it, let's look for a way that we don't cause that politicization of the issue. And I don't think my suggested language is necessarily inconsistent with the statute if it is in the policy that impact statement is a much more neutral observation than the negative implication of you are asking for something that's not legal, which is really what I believe it reads now.
I have to say, I'm a bit confused, and I would probably be benefited by an example, because we're talking drafting standards?
Madam Co-Chair, yes. So let me just quote the I'm going to quote the statute, ORS 192-488 here, that it says an open government impact statement must state whether the measure conforms to drafting standards, that's what this is, and describe how the measure would alter existing standards regarding the disclosure or exemption from disclosure of public records, and how the measure would impact public interests in disclosure that would be served if the public record were subject to mandatory disclosure. So that's a second element, and it is not affected by this policy.
Follow up, Mr. Chair?
Representative
I beg to differ, Council. Once you put in the open government impact statement a phrase that says the requester has asked for something that is in nonconformance with our policy, there is a very definite implication in that I think is unnecessary and inappropriate. And yes, you can say it does not meet legislative council's drafting standards, which, by the way, are not an objective set of standards that can be always agreed on by everybody. I've often disagreed with legislative council about the drafting of a particular provision in law, both before and during my time as a legislator. So that statement I'm not happy with. I recognize it's in law, but I don't think it implies that we have to go the next step in the impact statement and say, essentially, the requesters asked for something that does not conform with open government, essentially. So I do think I will, Mr. Chair, not be able to vote for this particular policy unless we're able to get some different language reflecting what I've been talking about.
Senator Boquist, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got about a few minutes here, but in light of the absence of Senator Brzezinski or the other co-chair, Representative Wilson of the subcommittee, frankly, we didn't vet this issue. I mean, we approached it purely as a technical issue. I clearly see what has been raised by the two representatives. I'm fine with the subcommittee taking it back and going back. We simply didn't, it's an issue that didn't come up. I do see the merits on both sides of the arguments, but it's not a debate that we had in the subcommittee. So the subcommittee is at a loss at this point to explain to you why we didn't do it.
Further discussion? Yes.
Thank you. It's really a question, I think. I heard the description of the statute, .488. Does that statute suggest that openness is always the most important value?
Thank you.
That's its objective.
Mr. Chair, Representative Barnhart, the statute doesn't state that. Whether it suggests that would be a matter of opinion.
Yeah.